Island.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to discuss the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Bill. After several weeks of debate and negotiation, the House and Senate Armed Services Committees have completed the conference report, which addresses critical issues facing our military and our country's national security. I'd like to thank Senator Inhofe, Chairman Smith, and Ranking Member Thornberry for their thoughtfulness, hard work, and cooperation throughout the process. This was not an easy conference. There were many difficult issues and differences of opinion that had to be worked through, and I think it's safe to say many have misgivings about one provision or another, but these are so many other positive provisions in the bill that it is a legislative success in my view. It is the art of compromise, and overall it is a very good conference report that helps the military and the American people. Last week, this conference report passed by a vote of 379 to 48 in the House, and I hope it will have the same strong support in the Senate. As we consider the conference report, I would like to highlight several areas that I am particularly pleased with and address several items that have been of concern to some members. In accordance with the budget agreement, the NDAA conference report authorizes $658.4 billion for the Department of Defense and national security programs of the Department of Energy, $71.5 billion for overseas contingency operations, and $5.3 billion in emergency funding to restore installations that were damaged by extreme weather and natural disasters. The conference report includes a number of important provisions to support our service members, their families, and the civilian employees of the Department of Defense who support them, including a 3.1% pay raise for the troops and the authorization of a number of bonus, special, and incentive pays to encourage enlistment and re-enlistment in the armed forces. We continue our efforts to eliminate sexual harassment and assault in our military. Over the last 12 years, we have legislated nearly 200 changes in law to combat sexual assault. In this conference report, we direct the Comptroller General to assess the implementation and effectiveness of these requirements. We also include a number of new provisions to continue our fight against this scourge, including increasing investigative resources to expedite investigations, increasing access to victims' legal counsel and victim witness program liaisons to support survivors of sexual assault, requiring additional training for commanders and requiring more transparency with sexual assault survivors about the progress of court-martial and administrative processes. We also include new provisions to more effectively address domestic violence and child exploitation, but we cannot rest. We must continue to insist that we do all we can to prevent this scourge from permeating our military forces. The conference report also includes the Fair Chance Act, which ensures that applicants for positions in the federal government and with federal contractors are treated fairly by restricting requests for criminal background information until the conditional offer stage. And as everyone is aware, the conference report includes 12 weeks of paid parental leave for the federal civilian workforce, an important benefit that will help the federal government recruit and retain the very best civilian talent. The conference report authorizes a number of important Army and Air Force programs. The final bill supports funding for 73 UH-60M Blackhawks and 48 AH-64 Apache helicopters in the Army. In addition, the conference bill authorizes an additional $75.6 million to accelerate the Future Long-Range Assault Aircraft Program, which is the top modernization program for the United States Army. The agreement also fully supports upgrading 165 Abrams tanks and includes an additional $249.2 million to integrate a medium-caliber weapon system onto the Stryker platform. This was an unfunded Army requirement which we were able to meet. With regard to the Air Force, the conference report includes $1 billion for 12 additional F-35A aircraft, which was an unfunded requirement of the Air Force, as well as $392 million for 4 additional C-130J aircraft to support increased inter-theater airlift capability. The bill also includes language that extends the Department's authority to protect critical facilities and assets from authorized operation of unmanned aircraft. I'm pleased the conference agreement includes key provisions and authorizes critical funding that will strengthen naval readiness and submarine production. This conference report reaffirms that we must maintain a minimum 11 aircraft carriers to protect our national interests around the world, and authorizes the first year of appropriations for the midlife refueling of the USS Harry S. Truman. It continues the construction of 2 Virginia-class submarines per year and supports the 9-boat multi-year contract with an option for a 10th boat that the Navy and Electric Boat signed earlier this month. The report also supports full funding for the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine. And I'm particularly pleased that the conference agreement also authorizes additional funding to continue to support the expansion of the submarine industrial base as well as workforce development. The conference report further bolsters maritime sea lift and mobilization by reauthorizing the Maritime Administration, including authorizing a new cable security fleet program and requiring the Secretary of the Navy to seek to enter into a contract for additional sea lift vessels. And finally, in order to keep our existing ships ready for deployment, the conference agreement authorizes additional funding for Navy ship and submarine depot maintenance to ensure key shipyard availabilities are not further delayed due to the existing maintenance backlog. The conference agreement authorizes full funding for the President's request to continue modernizing our nuclear deterrence and its triad of delivery platforms, which are rapidly aging out. This modernization effort began in 2010 and will continue for the next 15 to 20 years. Our ballistic submarines will begin to age out in the 2030s. Our heavy bombers will be replaced in the 2040s after having served for over 80 years, and our ICBMs will start to be replaced in the 2030s after having been on alert 24/7, 365 days a year for over 60 years. On the issue of low-yield nuclear weapons, while I opposed the deployment of the low-yield submarine ballistic missile in last year's bill and supported the provision in this year's House bill, which again would have prohibited deployment, that provision was not included in this year's conference report. I maintain that this is one weapon that will not add to our national security, but would only increase the risk of miscalculation with dire consequences, and regret that the House provision was not included in the conference report. Perhaps the most bipartisan topic in the fiscal year 20 NDAA was privatized housing reform. Over 30 provisions were included to help the Defense Department reinvigorate its oversight of housing companies. Over the last year, the Armed Services Committee received hundreds of calls for help directly from military families. Their stories of hardship, photos of substandard home conditions, and reports of non-responsive customer service by the housing companies spurred this comprehensive package of reforms. While this will likely not be the last NDAA to address housing problems, the fiscal year 20 bill makes a significant first step in several key areas. For example, we begin by requiring several standards in the Tenant Bill of Rights. We ensure that DoD has a single individual in charge of privatized housing, and in the event that housing companies are found to be responsible for causing medical problems, there will be a way for families to be compensated appropriately. Families will now be guaranteed access to work order systems and see what kind of home they're inhabiting prior to moving in, much like consumers get a Carfax report before they buy a used car. Companies must now disclose their bonus structure, document a complaint database made by families online, and are prohibited from forcing families to sign non-disclosure agreements. The DoD must also create and implement a standardized formal dispute resolution process and a uniform lease across all installations. We still have a long way to go as a Congress to ensure military families are getting the kind of quality homes and living conditions they deserve. But the fiscal year 2020 NDAA sets everyone on the right path, and we will continue to be watching both DoD and the housing companies. In another area of importance to the safety of all families, after too many years of status quo, the NDAA includes a number of new authorities and requirements for the DoD to confront its use of toxic PFAS chemicals. While we were ultimately unable to reach an agreement with the House on establishing new regulations through the Safe Drinking Water Act and other substantial improvements like cleanup via CERCLA and declarations of hazardous substances, the NDAA does make a number of new changes. For example, the Department of Defense must phase out the use of PFAS in firefighting forms on all its installations. The bill restores the National Guard's access to defense environmental restoration accounts, presses DoD to enter into cooperative agreements with local entities contaminated by PFAS chemicals, and extends the ongoing CDC human health study of PFAS in drinking water. With respect to countering the continued threat by ISIS, the bill extends the train and equip program that underpin our partnerships with the Syrian Defense Forces and Iraqi security forces, while ensuring appropriate congressional oversight of the use of such funds. Specific to Iraq, the bill also begins to normalize security assistance to Iraq by transitioning funding to enduring authorities. The conference report also includes the bipartisan CSER Syrian Civilian Protection Act, which is intended to help facilitate an end to the conflict in Syria and hold responsible those who have perpetrated war crimes. Specifically, the bill sanctions foreign persons who knowingly provide significant financial, material, or technological support to, or knowingly engage in a significant transaction with the Syrian government, and authorizes the Secretary of State to provide support to entities conducting criminal investigations, supporting prosecutions, or collecting evidence against those who have committed war crimes or crimes against humanity in Syria. With regard to Afghanistan, the bill extends several authorities to train and equip the Afghanistan National Defense and Security Forces. It also authorizes the Department of Defense to provide support for bottom-up government of Afghanistan-led reconciliation activities and mandates that the Secretary of State, in coordination with the Secretary of Defense, advocate for the inclusion of Afghan women in ongoing and future negotiations to end the conflict in Afghanistan. It is in the interest of all parties to forge a negotiated settlement that brings this conflict to a close while also protecting U.S. security interests and basic human rights. The bill also includes 4,000 additional special immigration visas and the extension of the SIV program so we can continue to honor commitments made to our wartime allies in Afghanistan. But as recent press reports indicate, after almost 18 years of combat and capacity building, Afghan military and political institutions are fragile, and the Taliban remains a serious threat. Moreover, terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and ISIS continue to pose a potential threat to the region and beyond. The Armed Services Committee and other committees of jurisdiction must undertake a comprehensive evaluation of the causes of the current situation and help facilitate a thoughtful way ahead. The conference report also contains a number of provisions to address the continuing threat of foreign malign influence from Russia and other countries. Deterring and countering this threat to our democracy is critical ahead of the 2020 presidential elections. The bill requires an update to our strategy for countering Russian malign influence, which needs to be better coordinated across the U.S. government departments and agencies, and expands that strategy to cover China, Iran, and other malign actors. To guard against malign foreign actors seeking to gain access to sensitive information through DoD contractors, the conference report includes a provision that I sponsored to enhance requirements for DoD contractors and subcontractors to disclose beneficial ownership information, including whether companies are subject to a foreign ownership, control, or influence. The Intelligence Authorization Bill, which is part of the conference report, also includes key provisions to counter foreign malign influence that have been of particular interest to me. First, it authorizes establishing a Foreign Malign Influence Response Center, which would bring together all elements of the intelligence community and serve as a primary organization for analyzing and integrating intelligence on foreign malign influence to provide a common operating picture across the government. The Intelligence Authorization Bill also authorizes the Director of National Intelligence to facilitate the establishment of an independent, nonprofit, social media data and threat analysis center to bring tech companies and researchers together to analyze indicators of foreign adversary threat networks across social media platforms. Finally, the conference report authorizes funds for research on foreign malign influence trends and indicators, including on foreign weaponization of deep fakes, that is, videos or other media that is digitally manipulated by foreign governments to spread disinformation. Turning to the Ukraine, the conference report authorizes an increase in funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative to provide critical aid, including lethal assistance to this strategic partner to defend itself against Russian aggression against its sovereignty and territorial integrity. With respect to Turkey, the conference report prohibits Turkey's participation in the F-35 aircraft program so long as it possesses the Russian S-400 air defense system. It also expresses the sense of Congress that Turkey's purchase of the S-400 system triggers congressionally mandated sanctions and urges the administration to impose those sanctions, which are long overdue. And as everyone is aware, this conference report does create a sixth service within the Air Force for a Space Force. Its mission will be to deter hostile actions in space against the United States and its allies. I would note that the organization created in this conference report is far more robust than that was originally passed in the Senate bill. I believe that this bill may be trying to do too much too fast and will require significant oversight. That being said, I do believe the attention we have paid to space and protecting our national security assets in space is vitally important, and I will continue to work on this issue in the coming years. And finally, with respect to substantive provisions, I'd like to touch on the issue that I find very problematic. I'm deeply disappointed that, despite my strong support, provisions intended to prohibit U.S. involvement in the civil war in Yemen, including arms transfers to the Saudi-led coalition, are not included in the final conference report. The civil war in Yemen is the world's worst ongoing humanitarian crisis, and the administration should be playing a more active and constructive role in ending the conflict and achieving a sustainable peace. I strongly support a prohibition on offensive arms transfers and other offensive support to the Saudi-led coalition, and will continue working to stop the bloodshed and suffering in Yemen. We must redouble our efforts in support of the Yemeni people through action, diplomacy, and increased humanitarian assistance. Iran, al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others continue to benefit from the chaos of this protracted conflict, and ending the war is both the United States and Saudi Arabia's long-term security interest. Stronger use of U.S. support for peace talks can and should set the conditions for Yemenis to negotiate a durable peace for the international community to begin the difficult but critical work of restoring stability and basic services to the people of Yemen. These objectives will remain significant priorities going forward. Mr. President, let me conclude by again thanking Senator Inhofe for his superb leadership, Chairman Smith for his superb leadership of the conference, which is a very challenging responsibility, and he discharged it with great skill. And also Ranking Member Mac Thornberry, who again was extraordinarily thoughtful and professional in his deportment. All the conferees for their bipartisan support throughout the process. This process has been a collegial and has been an example of a strong piece of legislation that addresses concerns of members on both sides of the aisle. And I'd also like to thank the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House Armed Services Committee for all their hard work in drafting a thoughtful and comprehensive bill. Their diligent work throughout the NDAA process has been integral in producing the strong bill before us today. And let me say this, they're not identified enough, in my view. The work that they did and continue to do has been superb, absolutely superb. And I want to personally thank them. Let me thank John Bonsall, Elizabeth King, Jen Stewart, and Paul Arcangeli for their help. They are the staff directors of the committees in both the House and the Senate. But if my colleagues will bear with me, I want to recognize all of our staff members because, again, they don't get the credit they deserve. Beginning alphabetically, Adam Barkins, Stephanie Barnett, Jody Bennett, Rick Berger, Augusta Binns Berkey, Leah Brewer, John Bryant, Debbie Sharello, Carolyn Chuda, John Clark, Maggie Cooper, Alan Edwards, Jonathan Epstein, Jory Feldman, Patty Jane Jeller, Tom Goffus, Creighton Green, Oscar Guzelsu, Marta Hernandez, Gary Howard, Beyer Iskander, Jackie Kerber, Gary Leland, Greg Lilly, Katie Magnus, Kirk McDonald, Carrie Lynn Machaki, Jackie Modeset, Bill Monahan, Mike Nobley, Sean O'Keefe, Tony Pancook, Brad Patu, Jason Parter, John Quirk, John Reardon, Arun Serafin, Catherine Sutton, Soliel Sykes, Arthur Teller, Fiona Tomlin, Eric Traeger, Dustin Walker, John Wasson, Tyler Wilkinson, Bob Winkler, Gwyneth Wilwine, and Jenny Wright. Thank you. I strongly support this conference agreement and hope it will receive the support of my colleagues in the Senate. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.